All right, let's get into one of the wildest, most controversial, and you could say most brilliant financial deals in the history of sports. This is the story of how one of the biggest football clubs on the entire planet was bought using its own money. So let's just start with the big question right up front. How on earth can you buy a global institution, a company worth nearly £1 billion, without actually spending a penny of your own cash? It sounds completely impossible, right? But believe it or not, that is exactly what happened to Manchester United. So let's set the scene. The year is 2005. Manchester United isn't just a football team. No, it's a massive global brand, a commercial juggernaut. And this is the really important part. The club had been basically debt-free since 1931. Think about that. They were a pillar of financial health. But that was all about to change in a very, very big way. And the change was instant. The second the Glazer family's takeover was finalized in May 2005, the club went from zero debt to being loaded with £540 million of it, overnight. And here's the absolute kicker. This wasn't the Glazers' debt. It was now the club's debt. This money wasn't for a new stadium. It wasn't for a star player. It was the loan used to buy the club itself. So how in the world did they pull this off? Well, they used a very powerful and pretty controversial financial trick. It's called a leveraged buyout, or LBO for short. And this was the secret weapon, the key that unlocked the whole deal and completely changed how people think about owning a sports team. So what exactly is a leveraged buyout? Okay, basically it means you use the company's own strengths against itself. You take its valuable assets, things like a stadium, its brand, its future income, and you use those as the security to borrow the huge amount of money you need to buy it. So in simple terms, all the financial risk gets dumped right onto the company that's being bought. Let's just break it down step by step. First, you find a target that's rich in cash and has great assets, just like Manchester United. Second, you go to the banks and you say, hey, lend us hundreds of millions to buy this club, and we'll use the club's own assets as the guarantee. Third, you take that borrowed cash and you buy the company. And then, step 4, the most important and craziest part, the debt is legally transferred onto the club's books. The club is now paying off the mortgage that someone else took out to buy. Okay, so that's the theory. Now let's look at exactly how the Glazers put this playbook into action. This wasn't some sudden impulse buy. It was a very calculated, piece-by-piece strategy that played out over several years. It all started pretty small back in 2003, but the huge, game-changing moment came on May 12, 2005. By snapping up a massive chunk of shares, they suddenly owned 57%. Now, under stock market rules, that meant they legally had to make an offer for the whole club. The dominoes started to fall. Just 4 days later, they hit 75%, which gave them the power to take the club private. And by the end of June, that was it. Game over. A total textbook execution. The takeover was done. The Glazers were in charge, but for Manchester United, the financial fight was just getting started. That LBO immediately strapped a mountain of debt onto the club, a debt that would hang over it for the next 2 decades. And it just kept growing. By 2010, the club's total debt had ballooned to a peak of £778 million. A big reason for this was the type of loans they used. Some were these really nasty high-interest loans called payment-in-kind loans. Just think of it like a credit card where instead of paying the interest every month, the interest just gets added back on top of what you already owe. It causes the debt to spiral, with interest rates hitting an insane 16.25%. So what's the total cost of all this borrowing? It's just astronomical. Since 2005, the club has paid out £969 million, not on players, not on the stadium, but just on interest, fees, and penalties for refinancing the debt. Let that sink in for a second. That's nearly £1 billion of the club's own money, just gone. And the fans saw this coming from a mile away. This quote from the Supporters Trust at the time just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captured what was happening. Every ticket, every jersey, every pint bought at the stadium. A piece of that money was now going towards paying off a debt that the club never wanted in the first place. But here's the other side of the coin. While the club was struggling to pay down this massive debt, the owners were setting up ways to take money out. This is the real genius, or depending on your view, the real problem, of the LBO model. You don't just use the asset to buy itself. You turn it into a personal cash machine. And the numbers are just staggering when you lay them all out. We already talked about the almost £1 billion in interest costs, but look at this. On top of that, There's another £167 million paid out in dividends, mostly to the Glazer family. Add in salaries for directors, management fees, and the grand total drained from Manchester United's own bank accounts since 2005 is well over £1.1 billion. And to really put that into perspective, you have to understand something about English football. Paying out dividends to owners, it just doesn't really happen. In the Premier League, United is the only club that does it on a regular basis. It really shows that the club was being run less like a community sports institution and more like a pure cash-generating asset for its owners. Now, this is a point that a lot of people miss. They see the club spending huge amounts on transfers and think, oh, the owners are investing. But that's not what happened. All that spending on players, all the wages, it was all funded by the club's own incredible commercial success. Not a single penny of owner money went in. In fact, the model was the opposite. Use the club's money to fund absolutely everything, including the debt and their own payouts. So fast forward to today. Almost 20 years later, what is the actual long-term legacy of this takeover? Well, the consequences have been felt everywhere, from the protests in the stands to the cracks in the stadium walls. And that legacy is impossible to ignore. You've got years and years of fan protests, like the famous Green and Gold movement. You've got the iconic stadium, Old Trafford, literally falling apart because money that could have been used for upkeep was being funneled to service debt. The whole thing was so controversial that the Premier League actually ended up banning these kinds of takeovers. But the damage was done. It set a whole new precedent for a type of ownership that's more about extracting rent than building a club. But let's be clear, from a purely financial point of view for the owners, it was an unbelievable, spectacular success. They acquired a club for £790 million, again, using the club's own money, and that same club was recently valued at around £5 billion in the deal with Sir Jim Ratcliffe. I mean, that is just a mind-blowing return on investment. So what do we take away from all this? The Glazer takeover of Manchester United was a masterclass in financial engineering. It literally wrote the book on how to acquire a priceless asset with almost zero personal risk, and then turn it into a machine for creating personal wealth. But it leaves us with one final, pretty uncomfortable question. When a community's beloved football club is treated like an ATM, who's the one that really ends up paying the price?